40% of the world's seaborne oil passes through a channel barely 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. On a clear morning, you can almost see both shorelines. And for decades, Iran has understood one terrifying truth. Whoever controls the Strait of Hormuz controls the heartbeat of the global economy. But here is what Tehran never fully calculated. What happens when the most lethal rotary wing gunship ever built shows up, and it has nowhere to hide from? This is the story of how that gamble collapsed. To understand the collapse, you first have to understand the strategy. Iran didn't just wake up one morning and decide to close the strait. This was a doctrine, a carefully constructed deterrence architecture built over 30 years of watching, learning, and preparing. The plan had three interlocking layers. Layer 1, the fast attack swarm. Dozens of Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy vessels, small, quick, and armed with anti-ship missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and even suicide drones strapped to speedboats. The idea was simple: overwhelm any naval response with sheer numbers, make the cost of intervention prohibitively high. Classic asymmetric warfare doctrine. Layer 2, the coastal missile batteries. Iran had invested heavily in Chinese-designed and domestically modified anti-ship cruise missiles positioned along its southern coastline. The Noor, the Qadr, the College Fars ballistic missile. These weren't showpieces. They were tested systems with genuine range and punch, capable of targeting anything from oil tankers to guided missile destroyers. Layer 3, the mining operation. This is the quiet one, the one that intelligence analysts had been watching most nervously. Iranian naval engineers had war-gamed laying minefields across the western approaches to the strait, the kind of layered minefield that forces vessels to slow down, bunch up, and become predictable targets for everything else in the arsenal. On paper, it was a credible strategy. Credible enough that oil markets had already convulsed. Shipping insurance rates spiked to levels not seen since the tanker wars of the 1980s. Several major carriers quietly rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 3 weeks to their voyages. The psychological phase of the blockade was already working, before a single shot was fired. Tehran had sent its signal. The message was clear: push back and the strait burns. Washington received that message, and it chose not to blink. The AH-64E Apache Guardian is not a subtle machine. It is 17,000 pounds of purpose-built lethality, capable of flying at night, in dust storms, in sea spray, conditions that ground most other aircraft. Its Longbow fire control radar can detect, classify, and simultaneously track up to 128 targets while flying low enough to stay under radar coverage. Its crew of 2, pilot and co-pilot/gunner, can engage up to 16 of those targets in under 30 seconds. Let me say that again. 16 targets, 30 seconds. Now picture what that means against a swarm of fast attack boats. The U.S. military's response to the escalating crisis was built around 3 Army aviation battalions quietly pre-positioned aboard LPD-class amphibious ships, vessels that, to outside observers, looked like routine naval presence. Nothing provocative, nothing that screamed first strike. But those ships were carrying something that would redefine the engagement geometry of the entire strait. 24 AH-64E Apaches, preloaded, crews briefed, rules of engagement signed, and then Iran made its first operational mistake. In the fictional scenario we're analyzing here, IRGCN commanders launched the first wave of fast attack boats not as a full offensive action, but as what they internally called a demonstration of resolve, a show of force intended to force a diplomatic climb down. 37 boats, armed, moving at speed across the northern shipping lane. They expected American surface vessels to maneuver away, to call for talks, to de-escalate. What they got instead was a radar return signature they had never seen before in real combat. The Apaches came in low, 50 feet above the water, nap of the earth across the waves, using the surface clutter to mask their approach. The Longbow radar painted the entire boat formation in under 4 seconds. The crew communications were, by accounts in this fictional reconstruction, remarkably calm, professional, almost cold. The first Hellfire missile was in the air before the IRGCN boats had any indication they were being engaged. Here is where I need to slow down and explain something that most coverage of this scenario misses entirely, because it's the thing that made Iran's entire strategic framework fall apart. The fast attack swarm doctrine was designed to defeat a specific threat, the American surface combatant. Destroyers, frigates, even carriers operating at range. The mathematics of that doctrine made sense in a certain kind of engagement, where you're trying to overwhelm the magazine capacity and defensive systems of large, relatively slow ships. It was never designed to defeat attack helicopters operating below radar coverage. This is a critical asymmetry that I think gets overlooked in broader geopolitical analysis. The Apache doesn't need to be anywhere near a destroyer to operate. It doesn't present a large radar cross-section. It doesn't have a predictable firing position. It is simultaneously the most mobile and the most lethal anti-surface platform in that theater. And Iran's coastal missile batteries, which were the insurance policy against American naval power, were oriented to engage vessels and high-altitude aircraft. They were not set up to reliably engage fast movers at low altitude, coming from multiple vectors, with near-zero warning time. So what happened when the first wave of IRGCN boats was engaged? The swarm lost cohesion. That's the tactical term. In plain language, chaos. Boats that had been operating in coordinated formations broke pattern. Some turned back toward Iranian waters. Others accelerated in different directions, which actually made them easier to track in isolation. The command and control infrastructure that relied on radio coordination between boat commanders was immediately overwhelmed by simultaneous engagements across the formation. And here is where the second layer of Iran's strategy began to crack. The coastal missile batteries were put on alert. They detected the engagement underway. But here's the problem. Firing those missiles into an active multi-vector engagement zone at a target set moving at 150 knots at low altitude, mixing with your own fast attack boats in the same water space, was a targeting nightmare. The fratricide risk was enormous. Iranian battery commanders in this fictional scenario hesitated. That hesitation, measured in minutes, was decisive. U.S. electronic warfare assets aboard the supporting naval vessels were simultaneously jamming Iranian command frequencies, degrading the communications that would have allowed coastal commanders to coordinate a coherent response. The helicopter assault and the electronic suppression were not sequential events. They happened at the same time. That simultaneity was the kill shot to Iran's decision cycle. The mine-laying operation, Layer 3 of the Iranian plan, was never fully executed. The vessels designated to seed the western approaches were caught in port by secondary operations. Without air supremacy over the strait, and without the ability to communicate clearly across the operational area, the mining ships never got their orders to move. The blockade, before it had truly begun, was already decomposing. Now I want to step back from the tactical detail and give you what I think is the genuinely important analysis here. Because this fictional scenario illuminates something real about how deterrence works, and fails, in the 21st century. Iran's strategic mistake was not lack of capability. Iran's mistake was designing a deterrence architecture around the assumption that the United States would respond in a predictable, conventional way. Their doctrine was calibrated against a specific American response template: heavy surface fleet, carrier-centric, slow to escalate, vulnerable to attrition. What they did not adequately account for was the U.S. military's institutional obsession with what strategists call left-of-boom operations, meaning interdicting a threat before it fully materializes, using the element of surprise, and collapsing the enemy's decision-making window rather than simply outgunning them. The Apache deployment was a left-of-boom move. By the time Iran's strategic leadership could process what was happening, the operational window to execute the blockade had closed. And once that window closes, it doesn't reopen easily. The first mover credibility that Iran needed to sustain any coercive pressure, the sense that they were willing and able to impose costs, had been visibly punctured. There is also something profound in the choice of platform here. Sending FA-18s or B-2 bombers carries enormous political weight. It looks like war. It triggers escalation ladders. It generates Security Council sessions. The Apache is different. It is a tactical, theater-level weapon. Its use is more ambiguous, harder to frame as a strategic attack, and easier to characterize as force protection, defending freedom of navigation, protecting shipping lanes, responding to an immediate threat. That ambiguity was deliberate. It allowed the United States to achieve a decisive military result while simultaneously maintaining political maneuver room. Tehran could not easily escalate to a strategic level in response to what was, technically, a tactical engagement. The trap was elegant. Within 72 hours of the initial engagement in this fictional scenario, three things happened in sequence that collectively sealed the fate of Iran's operation. First, oil markets stabilized, not because the crisis was over, but because the signal had been sent. Tanker operators and their insurers could see that the U.S. was both willing and capable of keeping the strait open. When that confidence returns to the market, the economic leverage of a blockade evaporates. Iran's primary coercive tool, the threat of economic disruption, had been neutralized before the full disruption could be achieved. Second, regional partners quietly moved. Gulf states that had been carefully ambiguous in their public posture, not wanting to antagonize Tehran, not wanting to commit to Washington, began extending discreet operational cooperation, basing access, intelligence sharing, airspace deconfliction. The fence-sitters always move when they see which way the operational wind is blowing. They moved. Third, and most importantly, the IRGCN's fast attack boat force, the centerpiece of the entire strategy, had been exposed as vulnerable in a way that could not be unexposed. The psychological damage to that doctrine may last a generation. Military institutions are deeply affected by operational failure. The commanders who built that strategy spent careers advocating for it. Its very public collapse doesn't just end a campaign, it reshapes the internal debate within Iran's defense establishment about what kind of military power is actually useful in this environment. That is a strategic consequence that outlasts any single operation. So what does this fictional scenario tell us? It tells us that geography is not destiny. Iran has spent decades believing that the physical choke point of the Strait of Hormuz was an irreplaceable source of strategic leverage. And it is. But leverage only works if you can actually apply it. The ability to threaten closure is not the same as the ability to close. And the gap between those two things is where the Apache lives. It tells us that asymmetric warfare doctrine cuts both ways. Iran built an asymmetric strategy to defeat a symmetric superpower. The United States responded with its own asymmetric tool, a platform that falls outside the traditional threat calculus, and turned the doctrine inside out. And it tells us something about the nature of deterrence in this century. Deterrence doesn't just fail when someone pulls a trigger. It fails the moment your adversary demonstrates, even once, even briefly, that your threat can be neutralized before it can be executed. Once that demonstration happens, the entire edifice of coercive power built on that threat starts to crumble. Iran's blockade strategy didn't collapse because the United States was stronger. It collapsed because the United States was faster, more adaptable, and willing to act before the window closed. In conflict, as in chess, the player who controls the tempo controls the outcome. The Strait of Hormuz remains open, the oil flows, and somewhere in Tehran's defense ministry, very serious men are sitting around a table, staring at maps, and asking each other a question they never expected to have to ask. What do we do now?